Well, hello and welcome. Thanks for checking out the video. In this particular video, we're going to look at creating this lumpy moss, or more specifically, we're going to look at how it was made. This is a little bit different than my regular videos. This is going to be more of a breakdown of a completed graph and how I've actually gone and done that so that it's not as hand-holdy. So because of that reason, this is not really a beginner-friendly video, I'll say. If you're completely new to InstaMAT or node-based material creation, check out these other videos that I've got a playlist for, kind of in the top right corner or in the description of the video. Those will be a lot more guiding videos to help you get started. So without further ado, let's take a look and see how I've created this. Now, if we look at the finished graph here, it's really not that complex. Really, the height map is pretty simple. There are a couple of gotchas, I guess, with some of the smaller fiber details and all that, and some height blending considerations. But really, it's not that challenging. And we can see here, this is going to be the final result of that. So let's jump on in to the very start here. So we'll see that kind of in this section here, this is where I've created those lumpy features. And this is going to pretty much drive the rest of the material here. And taking a look, it's really not that complicated. It's basically the same process, just repeated 3 times, essentially. So we start off with a purlin noise. And with this purlin noise, what I've done is I've just increased the gamma value. You can see here, this is what it looks like by default. I've also increased the scale. We'll take a look at that in a second here, but this is just a default purlin noise. And I've gone and removed a lot of those white values by just increasing this up to something like 4. And the reason that is, if we take a look, what I've done is I've blurred it and then used that as the height input for a slope blur. So this is a pretty standard way to kind of inflate a shape. So you can take the shape and then use it to inflate itself. And that's a really good way to get these kind of lumpy, bulbous shapes. So I've done that twice. Here is just a larger version. So I've scaled that at 12. And in this one, I've actually just only set the gamma to 3. And then again, just blurred that. And here is the blur value. So actually, I just think I used default for both. Yeah, so you don't even have to worry about those. And then the final result of these two, I've gone and blended together using just the screen blend mode and 100% opacity. And then the output of this, I've taken that and just repeated the process to kind of unify a lot of this. So I've gone and blurred it, this time a little bit higher of an intensity. And then here we go with our slope blur as well. So we've done an intensity of around 75% just to make that feel a little bit more cohesive with these two kind of varying levels of frequency together. So that's really the height map for this lumpy moss. And like I said, this is going to help us in the next section where we start to create some of these smaller fibers. So if we kind of zoom in here, we can take a look and see that a lot of the fibers are kind of adhering to the direction of these lumps. And that's where we're going to actually use this previous height. But before we get to that, let's take a look at how we created these little fibers. So I've used this height shape, or just shape generator, I should say, grayscale image. And we've just created kind of this like ellipsoid lens kind of thing here. I think I really just decreased the width, and that's pretty much it. And then I've taken that and applied a gradient across this using the subtract method and just, a very simple linear gradient. And then from here, what I've done is used 2 different circular scatter nodes. So this basically allows us to get a fan out of these blades so we can create these little tufts. And the reason that I've used this linear gradient here is to create a sense of like tiering once we start to scatter these around so that when they're blending over each other, right, blades that are going to be higher up on our height map are going to have a better time kind of blending over top of ones that are further down and make it look like they're kind of sticking out from like a little tuft area. So once we've created these, I've just kind of scaled them up and pushed them around. You might see that these aren't exactly kind of central to the image, and we'll see why in a second here. And then I've just gone and swirled these using a swirl node, so you can kind of give them some organic shape and bend and waviness and all that. And then from here, what I've done is I've used a guided scatter. So this area might look a little confusing, but if we take a look and see what is going on here, this is where we start to scatter all of these little tufts and use that previous height map to actually get the orientation of these. So with the guided scatter, it's a really nice and handy node. If you're familiar with Substance Designer, this is essentially the equivalent of the tile sampler node. However, there's a couple things that we actually need to enable before we can access some of that functionality. So the first one is going to be, let me just hit these. One little pet peeve of mine is InstaMAT, even if you set it back to the default value, it still gives you that redo. So what we need to set is this color input and the height input. And this is going to basically open up this functionality here. So that once we've done that, we're going to have these color and height input sections here. And this is where we get to start to create some of that tiering effect and the proper orientation for these. So we can see, let me start with the height here. Where do we have it here? Angle from slope. By default, this is going to be set to 0, and it's going to have pretty much the same direction for all of our little fibers here. So if we increase that all the way up, that's going to take whatever the slope is from the height input. And of course, the height input is just going to be a blurred out version of our previous height map over here. That's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. And I've also used that for the color input as well. So there are a couple other options in here that I've played around with. You're going to kind of get varying degrees of success or mileage out of them depending on what your height map looks like. However, we also need to use the color from this height map here to help blend these in a little bit better. Because by default, if we take a look here and I set this to 0, and I also set this back down to 0, right, we're going to get something that looks kind of like this. And this is just nonsense for the most part. This is really not going to be useful for pretty much every use case. So the first thing I like to do is give some variance so that there are varying color intensities or value intensities for these so we can actually see the individual tufts here and there. And then I also like to use the input factor. And the input factor is basically just going to help use these values here to blend these a lot nicer. Now, if we crank this value all the way up, right, we can kind of see what it's doing is it's almost like multiplying it against the backdrop here. But you'll see that sometimes in some of the areas, maybe in the darker areas, it starts to completely remove some of these fibers. And for my use case, I didn't really like that. Yours might, warrant doing something a little bit more intense. But I just went ahead and set this to something like 30%. So we're still getting some pretty, visible fibers kind of in those crevice areas, but they are darkening kind of as they get away from the apex of some of these lumps here. And then once I've gone ahead and created something that I'm happy with, I just basically drag out a duplicate version of this, again, with a lot less fibers here. And I think what I've done for this is just basically decreased the intensity here to something really low so that we're only getting a couple fibers here and there. And this is going to allow me to get some color variation in some of these fibers going forward once we get to the color map section. But for now, we can just kind of leave that and I'll come back to it. So once we have the final output of our fibers here, what I've done is I've just gone and blended those back into the previous height map. at a 50% opacity with the screen blend mode. And I also made sure to take our previous height map and just kind of darken it a little bit by decreasing the white output, just so that we're not getting any clipping kind of at the peak areas of the mounds, so that the fibers aren't conflicting or trying to add on top of these, and then it's just basically flattening out. So we can see this is what it kind of looks like without that levels, and we start to flatten things out a little bit, and this is what it looks like after, so a little bit nicer. So once we've done that, the next area that I kind of wanted to go to is just add a little bit of variation to, um, you know, or variety, I guess, to what could potentially have fallen onto the moss or, be entangled into the moss or something like that. And I just wanted to explore how we could actually go about blending different heights together. And so what I've done is very similar to the fibers. I've pretty much just taken this ellipsoid shape and squished it down. And then I've used another node, which is the bend node. I think it works very similarly to swirl, but maybe not, giving you the very swirly patterns. It just kind of like pushes some of the pixels around so that I've got a couple different shapes here. And again, using the guided scatter, I've gone and exposed the color and the height inputs using the lumpy height map again, so that we're getting a very consistent backdrop for these. So what I've done is just created a bunch of smaller ones and warped those around, again using some of the different parameters for our scatter nodes. So I'll just kind of scroll over these so you can take a look and get a good sense of what I've done. But once we've created that, essentially we've just gone and blended this back in, again using a screen blend mode to kind of overlay these on top of the material. And we want to be pretty gentle with how we're kind of blending these in, again, because we don't want them to be, you can kind of see in some areas here in our height map, right? It's kind of really contrasted to the area that it's in. So you might get some areas that look not too great because they're just super contrasted to what the backdrop is. So we want to be careful with how we're blending these in. But I didn't get too crazy with these. I just wanted a little bit of variation. I didn't want them to kind of steal the show. And that's really going to complete our height map here. So from here, this is where I start to kind of branch off and use this height map for the various output maps that we want to create. So the first one that I normally start with naturally is going to be our normal map. For the normal map, I kept this pretty low, to be honest. I found that putting it any higher than this value made it really noisy. And moss is kind of a tricky one because it is rather noisy, but because of its kind of like translucency, it feels really fuzzy and almost consistent, like a consistent sheen across the surface of these. So I kept it low to still get some of the normals from the fibers and the little twigs or whatever I've got in there. But then I've actually taken that height map and really blurred it and then created a normal map from that. And then using a normal combine, we go from this to something like this. And I know that it doesn't look super drastically different, but I'd rather have the bulbs in their like pure form contributing to the normal map more so than the individual fibers. And we can see here if I increase this, right? This is kind of the effect that we're going to be getting. And I think a value of 0.5 worked better for what I wanted. But again, for moss, it is a little tricky. My advice is that use something smoother and more bulbous like this to create the normals rather than relying on something like this. Actually, if we take a look and see, right, even at a value of 87%, this is pretty noisy and really not desirable. So with that, that's going to be our normal map output. I also go and create the roughness from here. So from our normal, I'll go and create a curvature node, and then I'll just invert that. And I also use a solid color just to kind of drive the overall roughness And then I just blend that in together using an add subtract. It's pretty simple. Again, I didn't really want to over engineer this. You can probably make it a little bit more detailed, but again, I'm kind of relying on a lot of the colors to do some of the work here because moss probably is going to have some type of like sheen or Fresnel effect on it if you're using this in a game or something like that. So I didn't really want to get too crazy with the roughness. Again, the detail is very, very fine, and it's probably going to be nipped down to a point that's not even really useful. So again, I didn't really want to get too crazy with this. And then from the height as well, we'll take our height map here, create an ambient occlusion map from this. And this is pretty straightforward and pretty much the gist of it. There are a couple of different options you can do for the ambient occlusion. You can kind of get some different types of AO maps just by changing the fall off curve. I found that something like linear is probably going to be fine and just decreasing the bias because by default, even though it's still pretty low, I find that it's actually missing out on a lot of the kind of areas at the apex of these. So I just decreased that to something really low. And easily enough, that's given me something that I'm satisfied with. All right, so that has been all the other outputs, but the major kind of player in this game here is going to be the color. So what I've done is from our height map again, I've created this gradient map. And this is just laying a base down for our color map, something very simple, a darker green for the areas that are kind of in the crevices and a bit of a lighter green to kind of set the stage for kind of those brighter, more bleached areas. And then I have taken this out and just hit it with an HSL node to kind of change the hue and the luminosity, make it a little bit more kind of trending towards yellow, I'll say. And then I've gone and blended that in, and I'm just using the average blending mode, opacity of 100%, and I am using a mask. So this is where, like I had mentioned previously, this whole little kind of setup takes effect. So like I had said, I had duplicated this piece out and just created a much less dense version of this. And then I used a blend height node to kind of blend these back in. So this is actually what we are blending into the height. And the reason I did this is I wanted to use this mask option to kind of just create a dynamic mask for us so that we could actually pick individual fibers here. And if they're kind of like going under and then over other fibers, this mask is going to be able to pick that up. I found this is probably the most straightforward way to kind of do this because otherwise you might have some fibers that go under and then over, but then the base color doesn't really know that. So it's just coloring the entire thing. So you might have some weird kind of like overlap issues with the color and the normal map not lining up. So that's the reason I've gone ahead and done this. And I'm just taking essentially that mask and plugging that in so that we're getting, again, just some very, very minor fiber like variance in the color. From there, what I'm doing is I'm taking another HSL node, again, really cranking this up towards yellow and blending that back in. So we're getting something like this and then kind of pushing it towards this area. So this is going to be a bit more of just like an overlay on top to give us some kind of height variation difference. And that's going to create a very nice solid gradient base. And we're just using, if I kind of zoom all the way back, the result again of this blend height, but we're using the output of these, right? Because this is giving us that gradient from kind of top to bottom for each one of these. So this is a very useful combination of these two here. We're using it for pretty much the basis of the moss color. So that's going to take us this far here. I'm then going to take the height map and just create a black and white gradient, do a high pass on it. So this is what we have before. This is what we have after. And that's going to take us from here to here. Again, just a bit of a subtle difference, but it's really pushing kind of both extremes of this. The shadows a little bit more into the darker regions, and then some of the highlights into some of the brighter regions. And I just used a very subtle overlay of about 15%. I found that you don't really want to overdo it with things like this, especially overlays. Just keeping it subtle is going to really get you, ascend you to that place that you really need it to be. So that's the base for our moss. From there, what I've done is just kind of added a bit of subtle detail underneath. Now, this might depend on kind of how you anticipate this moss is going to be oriented. But for my design, I figured that this might be something that is blended on trees or a lot of like objects going vertically, maybe rocks or something like that. So I felt a little bit more comfortable orienting this, or kind of locking it in to a more consistent orientation. But if this might be like on the forest floor or something that's intended to be a little bit more omnidirectional, you might want to skip this part. So you'll see that it's a very subtle effect. But what I'm doing is I'm adding this color to the bottoms, kind of all of these mounds here. And what I'm doing is I'm taking my normal combine, I am splitting this open and just taking the green channel from our normal map and running this through a levels so that we're getting kind of only the bottoms of some of these areas. I've also had to go and flip the output channels here so that we're not getting white at the top. And then just blending that in using just the default blending mode and a low opacity so that, again, we're getting some nice kind of color and like decay almost or something in those kind of recessed areas. And then from there, what I've done is added a little bit of highlights again, kind of at the peak. So we went from this to something like this. Again, very, very subtle. And all I've done to do this is taken the previous blend, run it through an HSL node with a pretty significant decrease in saturation, and then I'm just using the height map with a histogram select. So I'm selecting kind of only the more upper top regions of that histogram, and so that's going to kind of again further nudge us only those specific regions into a bit of a brighter place. So once we've completed that, the next thing I'd like to take a look at is just simply creating some solid colors for our little thistles here. So again, I just have a nice solid color node, blending that in, and I am just going to use pretty much this scatter node that we created. If I go all the way back, right, I'm just using the output from this guided scatter. And then I'm going to kind of like shift up. You can see this is what it looks like previously. And then this is what it looks like after, just to kind of create a more binary mask to really create some solid colors for these. I didn't really do too much with these, to be honest. I felt that it was probably good enough just for how simple and small these were. You might want to take a look at actually kind of beefing that up a bit, but for my use case, again, they're so small, you're never really going to see them. And if these textures start to get mipped down, it's probably going to end up being wasted time anyways. So that's really it for the thistles. From here, what I've done is just added a pretty easy kind of like grunge across all of these just for more color variation. So I've just taken the previous base color here and run it through an HSL node again, changing the hue, bumping up the luminosity. And I've just used a spots 5 node as our opacity input to create something like this. Again, I think I pretty much left both of these at default. Actually, I don't know, is default 100? Yeah, exactly. So I've left them at default here. And then taken this, run this through a sharpen, and you can see actually how much clarity that really starts to bring. You want to be careful with sharpen as well because you can really start to create some crazy effects and some haloing if you do kind of bump this up to an extreme. But again, 20% or lower is kind of where I stick with the sharpen nodes. And that's pretty much it. That is our material completed. So we can take a look. That's the base color, our height, our normal map, again, roughness, which probably will get mipped out at some point, and our AO. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.